Mother loses child at birth. But when she entered the morgue she caught the doctor. The night was chaotic as 28-year-old Eloise Carter was rushed through the hospital's sterile corridors. Her screams of labor pain echoed off the walls, drawing concerned glances from other patients and visitors. The harsh glow of the fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the faces of the paramedics, who hurried her toward the labor and delivery ward. Eloise gripped the sides of the gurney, her knuckles white with tension, each contraction feeling like a tidal wave of pain crashing over her. She had always envisioned this moment differently, calm, prepared, with her boyfriend Corey by her side, but instead she was alone, terrified, and completely overwhelmed. As they burst through the double doors of the labor and delivery unit, Dr. Alan Greaves was already there, his face a mask of professional concern. He quickly took charge, barking orders to the nurses. "Get her into room 3. I want fetal monitors set up immediately. Where's her chart?" A nurse hurried forward with a clipboard, which Dr. Greaves snatched, scanning it rapidly. Eloise tried to focus on his face, searching for reassurance, but another contraction hit, making her cry out in agony. "Miss Carter," Dr. Greaves' voice cut through her pain. "I'm Dr. Greaves. We're going to take good care of you and your baby. Just breathe through the contractions, okay?" Eloise nodded weakly, struggling to recall the breathing exercises she'd learned in her prenatal classes, but everything felt distant now, lost in the fog of pain and fear. The paramedics transferred her from the gurney to the bed with practiced precision. Nurses swarmed around her, attaching monitors and checking her vitals. Dr. Greaves turned to the staff. "All right, I want everyone out except Nurse Olivia," he commanded. The nurses exchanged quick glances but complied, leaving the room with the paramedic. Only one nurse remained, a young woman with kind eyes and a nervous energy. "Are you sure, doctor?" Nurse Olivia hesitated, her voice a little unsure. "This is my first solo work in the labor room." Dr. Greaves' expression softened just slightly. "Don't worry, Olivia. This is your chance. Just follow my instructions and you'll do fine." Once the others left, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had been a chaotic rush of activity became a more intimate scene. Eloise in increasing pain, Dr. Greaves maintaining clinical control, and Nurse Olivia providing gentle emotional support. Olivia moved to Eloise's side, taking her hand. "Try to steady your breathing," she encouraged, her voice calm despite her own nervousness. "In and out. You're doing great." Eloise clung to Olivia's hand like a lifeline, trying to focus on her breathing as another contraction built. The pain was like nothing she had ever experienced, feeling as if it consumed her whole being. Dr. Greaves positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his focus intense as he monitored Eloise's progress. "You're at 8, Miss Carter," he said. "It won't be long now. When you feel the urge to push, let us know." Time stretched and compressed in strange ways as Eloise lost track of how long she'd been there, caught in the endless cycle of pain and brief moments of respite. Nurse Olivia remained by her side, offering words of encouragement and wiping her brow with a cool cloth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eloise felt a new sensation, the overwhelming urge to push. "I think it's time," she gasped between contractions. Dr. Greaves nodded. "All right, Eloise. When the next contraction comes, I want you to push with everything you've got. Nurse Olivia, support her back." As the contraction built, Eloise bore down, a primal scream escaping her throat as she pushed with all her strength. "Good, good," Dr. Greaves encouraged. "The baby's head is crowning." After what felt like hours, Eloise was exhausted, unable to continue. As the baby's shoulder began to emerge, she faltered, her strength failing her. "Keep pushing, Eloise," Dr. Greaves urged. "You've entered the second stage of labor. We need to get this baby out." But Eloise couldn't. Her pushes became weaker, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Dr. Greaves' brow furrowed as he assessed the situation. "We may have a stalled labor," he said, his voice tight with concern. "This could risk bleeding and harm both mother and baby. We need to intervene." He turned to Nurse Olivia. prepare a Pitocin drip. We need to strengthen her contractions." As Nurse Olivia hurried to comply, Dr. Greaves spoke to Eloise, his voice soft but firm. "We're going to give you medication to help speed up your labor. If that doesn't work, we may need to consider vacuum extraction." "Do I have your consent?" Eloise, barely able to focus, nodded weakly. "Anything. Just help me." The Pitocin was administered, but instead of helping, it seemed to intensify Eloise's pain without progressing the labor. Dr. Greaves' concern deepened. "We need to move to vacuum extraction," he decided. "Nurse Olivia, prepare the vacuum extractor." As Nurse Olivia readied the equipment, Dr. Greaves turned back to Eloise. "I'm going to give you pain relief medication. It will help manage the pain and relax you, but I need you to push when the next contraction comes. We'll use the vacuum to assist. Push when you feel the urge, and we'll pause when you do. Do you understand?" Eloise nodded, desperate for any relief. As the medication took effect, the pain dulled to a low roar, allowing her to focus on Dr. Greaves' instructions. "All right, Eloise," Dr. Greaves said. "Next contraction, push with everything you have." With one final, monumental effort, Eloise pushed. The strange, sliding sensation was followed by an eerie silence. The absence of her baby's cry was deafening. Eloise's heart raced. "Why isn't he crying?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. Dr. Greaves worked quickly, his face tense with concentration as he patted the baby's thigh. "Nurse Olivia, get the resuscitation equipment ready. We might need it." Eloise tried to sit up, desperate to see what was happening, but dizziness overtook her. The room spun, and the voices around her grew distant and muffled. "Doctor, she's losing a lot of blood," Nurse Olivia said, her voice distant. "Stay with us, Eloise," Dr. Greaves called through the fog. He gave her something to help with the bleeding and pain, and Eloise felt warmth spread through her veins. The pain receded, and with it, her awareness began to slip away. She tried to ask about her baby, demand answers, but her tongue felt heavy in her mouth. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was Dr. Greaves saying, "That's it?" But whether he was talking to her or about the baby, she couldn't tell. As consciousness faded, Eloise's final thought was of her child. Had she heard a cry? Had there been any sign of life? The questions swirled in her mind as she drifted into oblivion, the beeping of monitors and the urgent voices of Dr. Greaves and Nurse Olivia fading into silence. Eloise's eyes scanned the unfamiliar room, the absence of her baby hitting her like a physical blow. Anxiety surged with every passing second. Trembling, she reached for the SOS button beside her bed. The wait for a response felt endless, her heart racing as countless scenarios ran through her mind. Finally, the door opened and a nurse stepped inside. It wasn't Olivia, but a different nurse, her steps measured, her expression carefully controlled. "Where's my baby?" Eloise's voice cracked, desperate. The nurse's professional demeanor faltered for a moment, betraying the weight of the news she had to deliver. She approached Eloise's bedside, her voice gentle yet firm. "Miss Carter, I'm so sorry, but your baby didn't survive." The words hit Eloise like a blow to the chest, knocking the air from her lungs. She struggled to sit up, frustration mounting as the 4 lines and medical restraints confined her. "No," she gasped, shaking her head. "That can't be right. I gave birth to him. I need to see him. I need to talk to the doctor." The nurse placed a comforting hand on Eloise's arm. "I understand. I'll call Dr. Greaves right away. Try to stay calm, Miss Carter. I'll be back soon." As the nurse left, Eloise was left alone in the room. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of her last conscious moment. Dr. Greaves' final words echoed in her mind. That's it. She tried desperately to remember whether she had heard her baby cry, but the effects of the medication blurred the line between memory and imagination. Had there been a cry, a moment of life, or had it all been silence? Her hand moved to her now empty belly, and a sob caught in her throat. She had carried this child for 9 months, felt every kick, every hiccup. How could it all end like this, in a sterile hospital room with no chance to even hold him. As she waited for Dr. Greaves, a sense of confusion began to grow alongside her grief. Something didn't feel right, though she couldn't quite figure out what it was. The uncertainty made her feel adrift in a sea of loss and unanswered questions. The morning light filtered through the hospital window, casting an almost ethereal glow, but it only seemed to accentuate the grim reality of the situation. Eloise lay in the bed, her body aching and her mind foggy from the ordeal she had just endured. The room was sterile, impersonal, a painful reminder of her loss. The door creaked open, and Eloise's heart lurched as Dr. Greaves entered, followed closely by Nurse Olivia. The nurse was carrying a small white-wrapped bundle, and Eloise's emotions swelled in a rush of hope, fear, and an overwhelming sadness. Dr. Greaves approached her bedside, his face a mask of professional composure. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice gentle but clinical, "how are you feeling this morning?" Eloise struggled to find her voice, her throat raw from earlier screams. I don't know," she whispered. "Where's my baby? Please, I need to see him." The nurse had mentioned something about. Dr. Greaves exchanged a glance with Nurse Olivia before nodding solemnly. "Of course," he said. "Nurse Olivia has brought him for you." As Nurse Olivia stepped forward, Eloise's world narrowed to the small bundle in her arms. With trembling hands, she reached out, and the nurse carefully transferred the weight of the baby into her embrace. But as Eloise held her child, a cold shiver ran down her spine. Something was terribly wrong. The bundle felt too light, too still. With shaking fingers, she pulled back the blanket, and a gasp escaped her lips. The baby's skin was an unnatural purple, his tiny features frozen in an eternal stillness. His body was ice cold against her warm skin, a stark reminder that this was not a living child, but one who had already been in the morgue. Tears welled up in Eloise's eyes as she traced her finger along his cheek. The skin felt waxy, unreal. What should have been a moment of joy, the miracle of new life, had turned into a heartbreaking encounter with death. "What happened?" Eloise asked, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't look away from her child's face, trying to memorize every detail, even in this unnatural state. Dr. Greaves cleared his throat, his words flowing with practiced precision. "It was a boy," he began, his tone professional but tinged with sympathy. "There were complications immediately after birth. His heart rate dropped dangerously low, and despite our best efforts at resuscitation, we couldn't revive him." Eloise nodded numbly, her mind struggling to process the information. She looked up at Dr. Greaves, searching his face for answers. "But why is he so purple?" she asked, voice trembling. "And so cold? How long has it been?" Dr. Greaves shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with Nurse Olivia. "You were unconscious for about 4 hours after the delivery," he explained. "Given the circumstances, we had to move him to the morgue shortly after. That's why he looks this way." The word morgue hit Eloise like a punch to the gut. Her baby, the child she had carried and loved for 9 months, had been alone in that cold, sterile place while she was unconscious. The thought was nearly too much to bear. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Miss Carter," Dr. Greaves added softly, but Eloise barely heard him. Her attention was fixed entirely on her son. She traced the curve of his nose, the shape of his lips, trying to imagine what he would have looked like alive, healthy. Can I have some time alone with him?" she asked, her voice breaking. Dr. Greaves hesitated, his professional demeanor slipping for just a moment. "Of course," he said, but then he added, "I must insist that Nurse Olivia remain. It's hospital policy for safety reasons. We've had unpleasant cases in the past with traumatic patients." The contrast between his clinical detachment and Eloise's raw grief created an uncomfortable tension in the room. As Dr. Greaves left, the atmosphere shifted. Nurse Olivia moved closer, offering silent support. Eloise hardly noticed her, lost in her world of grief and memories. "I had so many dreams for you," Eloise whispered to her son, her voice choked with tears. I imagined your first smile, your first step. I wondered what your voice would sound like. What kind of person you'd grow up to be. As she spoke, her mind wandered back to the early days of her pregnancy. You know, she said, her voice trembling, I was so scared when I first found out about you. It wasn't an easy time in my life. Nurse Olivia listened silently, her face a mask of compassion as Eloise continued. My ex-husband kept coming back into my life, years after our divorce. I was afraid, unsure if I could do this, but as time passed, I fell in love with you. I started dreaming of our future together. Eloise's fingers continued to trace her son's features, memorizing every tiny detail. The room felt suspended in time, the outside world fading away as mother and child shared this final, heartbreaking moment. The father? Nurse Olivia asked softly, her voice hesitant. Was it your ex-husband, ma'am? Eloise looked up with a sad smile. It's complicated, she said simply. Very complicated? Nurse Olivia nodded, understanding without pushing for more. Instead, she moved closer, offering silent support as Eloise continued to hold her son. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Eloise alternated between quiet tears and whispered words of love to her child. She spoke to him about the nursery she had prepared, the toys she had bought, the future she had imagined for them. As the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the room, Eloise felt the finality of the moment begin to settle in. She would have to let her son go forever. Just as the thought crossed her mind, there was a soft knock at the door. Dr. Greaves entered, his face solemn. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said gently but firmly, but if you're ready, we need to take the baby back to the morgue. Eloise's arms instinctively tightened around her son. Already, she whispered, her voice breaking. Dr. Greaves nodded, a flicker of sympathy crossing his face. I know it's hard, but it's necessary. We'll take good care of him, I promise. With a heavy heart, Eloise placed one last kiss on her baby's cold forehead. Goodbye, my love, she whispered, her tears falling onto his still face. Mama loves you so much. With gentle hands, Nurse Olivia took the baby from Eloise's arms. The loss of his weight left Eloise feeling empty, as though a part of her had been torn away. As Nurse Olivia held the baby, Dr. Greaves turned his attention to Eloise, performing a perfunctory check of her vitals while explaining the postpartum care expectations. We'll give you a take-home kit and some medication to manage the pain and prevent infection, he said. You should expect some postpartum bleeding, but it should reduce over the next 24 hours. Normal bleeding like a period is expected for a week or more. Eloise nodded numbly, only half listening as the doctor continued his instructions. Before leaving, Dr. Greaves turned to Nurse Olivia. Give her the remaining medication before she's discharged, he instructed. I'll take care of the baby. Nurse Olivia passed the baby to Dr. Greaves carefully, and as he left the room, Olivia turned back to Eloise. Her voice was gentle as she began explaining the emotional challenges ahead. There's something you should be prepared for, she said softly. Your body doesn't know yet. It will still produce breast milk. Eloise felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her at this cruel reminder of what should have been. Olivia continued, her voice filled with compassion. It should stop within 2 to 3 weeks without the baby nursing. There's an anti-log supplement that can help if it becomes painful. The doctor didn't prescribe it, but you can request it as an additional purchase from the pharmacy if needed. Nurse Olivia helped Eloise sit up on the bed, gently reminding her to move cautiously and avoid strenuous activities to aid her recovery. After handing her the morning medication, an ibuprofen and an antibiotic, Olivia mentioned that Eloise could leave the hospital whenever she felt ready after she finished her current 4-drip, which only had a little left. You might find it more restful at home, she added. However, as Eloise considered going home, a sudden realization hit her. She had arrived in such a rush that she was without any personal belongings, not even the bare essentials. My phone? Eloise said suddenly. I remember having it when I came in last night. Do you know where it is? Nurse Olivia nodded, moving to a secure cabinet on one of the shelves. Another nurse secured it here last night, she explained, retrieving the device. As Eloise took her phone, it felt like a tangible link to the outside world, her only connection to a world that now felt irrevocably changed. Eloise switched on her phone, relieved to see it still had plenty of battery life. The soft glow of the screen illuminated her face in the dimly lit room, casting shadows that accentuated the exhaustion etched into her features. As she scrolled through the missed calls and messages, the reality of her situation began to sink in. A new nurse approached near the head of the bed, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. With practiced hands, she removed the 4 infusion from Eloise's arm, the now empty bag hanging limp on the stand beside the bed. "There you go," Olivia said gently, pressing a small cotton ball to the insertion site. Eloise flexed her arm, wincing slightly at the soreness. Her voice barely above a whisper, Eloise spoke, "Everything feels surreal. I was with child, but now I'm not." Olivia nodded sympathetically, her kind eyes filled with understanding. "That's perfectly normal after what you've been through. Is there anyone coming to pick you up, family or friends?" Eloise shook her head, a wave of loneliness washing over her. "No. I'll just take a taxi." Concern flickered across Olivia's face. "Are you sure? I'd be happy to help with the taxi fare if you need it, since you don't have your bag." "No, thank you," Eloise interrupted gently, managing a small, grateful smile. "I have money at home or I can pay from my phone. I appreciate the offer, though." Olivia hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right if you're sure. Just remember, it's okay to accept help sometimes." She began gathering her things, preparing to leave. "I'll be going now, but if you need anything—" "Wait," Eloise called out suddenly, surprising even herself with the urgency in her voice. Olivia turned back, her eyebrows raised in question. Eloise took a deep breath, her heart pounding. The request she was about to make felt simultaneously crucial and impossible. "I need to ask you something," she began, her voice trembling. Olivia moved closer to the bed, her full attention on Eloise. "What is it?" "I didn't have enough time," Eloise said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "To say goodbye. I mean, is there any way I could see my baby one last time before I leave? I'd like to take a picture with him." Her voice broke on the last words, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, it would mean so much to me." Compassion flickered in Olivia's eyes, but there was hesitation. "Oh, Eloise," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, but the baby's been taken to the morgue. We can't take patients there, and I don't have access. We'd need to contact the morgue staff." Eloise felt a wave of desperation wash over her. She reached out, grasping Olivia's hand. "Please," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "This would be my last chance. If I had known where my phone was earlier, I would have taken a picture in the room. I need to keep something, a memory of him. He was alive for 9 months inside me. Please help me." Olivia's resolve visibly wavered, her professional demeanor cracking in the face of Eloise's raw emotion. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked softly. Eloise nodded emphatically, hope blooming in her chest. "I have to do this. Please." After a moment of internal struggle, Olivia sighed. "I'll try to help," she said, "but I can't promise anything. This is against hospital policy, and it should be off the record." She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen as she typed a message. The room fell silent, save for the soft tapping of Olivia's fingers and Eloise's shaky breathing. Each second felt like an eternity as they waited for a response. Finally, Olivia's phone buzzed. She read the message, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay," she said after a moment, looking up at Eloise. "I think I can make this happen, but we need to be quick and discreet. Can you walk?" Eloise nodded, already pushing herself up from the bed. Her body protested, muscles sore and weak, but determination gave her strength. Olivia helped her into a robe, then led her out of the room. The hospital corridors seemed different now, quieter, more ominous. Their footsteps echoed softly as they made their way through the maze of hallways, Olivia guiding them with purpose. Eloise's heart raced, a mix of anticipation and fear coursing through her veins. They paused outside the medical staff resting room. Olivia's eyes darted around nervously. A moment later, a woman in scrubs emerged, Olivia's friend from the morgue. The two spoke in hushed tones, their conversation a blur to Eloise's ears. All she could focus on was the access card the friend reluctantly handed over. "Return it as quickly as possible," the friend warned, voice low and urgent. "This is against protocol. If anyone finds out," Olivia nodded gratefully, tucking the card into her pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll be quick. I promise." As they continued their journey towards the morgue, the hospital seemed to transform around them. The cheerful paintings and motivational posters gave way to stark, unadorned walls. The air grew cooler, and an eerie silence settled over them. Eloise's mind raced with a mixture of grief and anticipation. She was about to see her son again, her beautiful boy, taken from her too soon. Part of her wondered if she was making a mistake, if seeing him again would only deepen her pain. But a stronger part of her knew that she needed this closure. They reached the morgue entrance, an imposing door with a key card scanner. Olivia hesitated briefly before swiping the borrowed card. The lock clicked open, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent corridor. As Olivia pushed the door, the cold air of the morgue hit them. Eloise shivered, unsure if it was from the chill or the anxiety that had taken hold of her. They stepped inside and froze. Standing in the middle of the room was Dr. Greaves, his shock at their presence mirroring their own. For a moment, nobody moved. The air was thick with tension and unsaid questions. Nurse Olivia was the first to snap back to reality. "I'm sorry, doctor," she said, her voice trembling. "There's no sign anyone's in here." Dr. Greaves cut her off sharply. "What are you doing here?" His voice carried an edge, authoritative but also laced with something else. Fear, perhaps. "Why have you brought a patient to the morgue without permission?" Before Olivia could answer, Eloise stepped forward. Despite her weakness, her voice rang out strong, fueled by a mother's determination. "It's not her fault," she said firmly. "I insisted on seeing my baby one last time. I just want a picture to remember him by." Dr. Greaves looked around nervously, his usual composure clearly off. Eloise barely noticed his unease, her focus drawn to the morgue table where her baby lay. Beside him was another infant, the contrast stark. Her child's skin was a deep purple, a painful reminder of the life lost. The sight of her baby next to the other made the grief even more unbearable. Dr. Greaves, noticing Eloise's gaze, moved quickly to place the other baby into a box, shutting it with haste. "This one didn't make it either," he muttered, his words tumbling out. "It needs to go for examination." The atmosphere in the room had shifted, filled with unspoken tension. Eloise's eyes remained fixed on her son, a knot in her stomach. Something wasn't right, but right now all she could do was hold on to this moment, this precious final time with her child. Dr. Greaves hurriedly picked up the box containing the other baby, his movements hurried and uncharacteristically clumsy. "Don't linger too long," he warned, his voice now a mix of authority and barely concealed anxiety. "You're not supposed to be here. I'll make an exception, but—" He paused, his expression softening just a bit as he looked at Eloise. "I'm truly sorry for your loss." As Dr. Greaves rushed out, the heavy door clicked shut behind him with a muffled thud. Eloise was left alone with Nurse Olivia and her baby. The silence of the morgue was oppressive, only the low hum of the refrigeration units filling the space. Eloise's hands shook as she approached the cold metal table. The warmth of her skin against her baby's icy body sent a shudder through her. Reverently, Eloise lifted him into her arms, holding him close, just as she had imagined doing during her pregnancy. "Olivia," Eloise whispered softly, barely audible. "Could you please take a picture for me?" Olivia nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears as she took Eloise's phone. The camera flashed once, capturing the heartbreaking image of mother and child in their final, bittersweet reunion. Olivia took several more shots from different angles, but Eloise remained focused solely on her son. She traced the delicate curve of his nose, the shape of his lips, committing every detail to memory, despite the unnatural hue of his skin. "You're so beautiful," Eloise whispered, her tears falling gently on his face. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry we didn't have more time." The weight of her grief seemed to crush her. Reluctantly, knowing time was running out, Eloise placed one last, lingering kiss on her baby's forehead. "Goodbye, my love," she murmured, her voice breaking. With great effort, she handed him back to Olivia, who gently returned him to the freezer box and closed it. As they prepared to leave, Eloise turned to Olivia, her eyes swollen and red but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said thickly. "I'm sorry for putting you in this position." Olivia shook her head, offering a sad smile. "Actually, I'm not that surprised," she said softly. "My friend in the morgue has told me several times that grieving mothers often request to see their babies and take pictures. It might sound morbid to some, but it's a reality for many patients. I understand the need for closure. Normally, they bring the baby to the hospital room, but I understood your time was limited earlier." They made their way out of the morgue, the door closing behind them with finality. The hospital corridors seemed too bright now, almost blinding after the dimness of the morgue. As they walked, Eloise's mind replayed the events of the last 24 hours. "Usually, they bring the baby to the hospital room, but I understood your time earlier was so limited. Let's get you to the front desk to complete the discharge paperwork," Olivia said gently, guiding Eloise through the maze-like hallways. At the administration desk, Eloise explained her situation, her voice sounding distant and detached. "I don't have my wallet. I was brought in as an emergency." The staff member nodded in understanding, fingers flying over the keyboard. "No problem. We'll send the bill to your address. Just fill out this registration form for now." Eloise filled out the forms mechanically, her hand moving across the page as an unsettling feeling gnawed at her. She couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong, but a dull ache in her head made it hard to focus. Once the forms were completed, the staff member handed Eloise a small bag containing her medication and discharge instructions. "Take care, Miss Carter," the staff member said kindly. "And again, we're so sorry for your loss." Eloise nodded numbly, clutching the bag to her chest. It felt like a lifeline. She turned to Nurse Olivia, who had stayed with her through it all. "Thank you for everything," Eloise said softly. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Olivia squeezed Eloise's arm gently. "You're stronger than you know, Eloise. Take care of yourself. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." With a final goodbye to Olivia, Eloise stepped out of the hospital into the bright afternoon sunlight. The world around her seemed too loud, too vibrant, too full of life. Her grief weighed heavy on her heart, a stark contrast to the bustling world that carried on without her. She made her way to the taxi stand, her steps slow and unsteady. Pulling out her phone, Eloise saw a list of missed calls and messages. Her heart clenched at the sight of Corey's name and work colleagues, all asking where she was, if everything was okay. She couldn't find the words to explain. How could she describe the fear, the joy, the pain, and the devastating loss of the past 24 hours? In the end, she sent a brief message to Corey. "Something's happened. I'll explain everything when you have time to call. I need to talk to you." As a taxi pulled up, Eloise climbed in and gave the driver her home address. Her voice sounded strange to her ears. As the car pulled away from the curb, she leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the world blur outside. Life went on, but for Eloise, nothing would ever be the same. As Dr. Greaves had suggested, they should have looked similar, but the thought quickly faded. Eloise pushed it aside, convinced that grief and trauma were distorting her perceptions. Doctors, after all, were held to high moral standards. They couldn't possibly do anything unethical, could they? Shaking her head to clear these unsettling thoughts, she made her way to the bathroom. She turned on the shower, letting the steam fill the small space as she undressed. The hot water began to ease the tension in her muscles. She stood there for a long time, imagining that somehow the water could cleanse her of her grief and confusion. As the steam cleared from the mirror, Eloise found herself staring at her reflection. Her eyes lingered on features she had always taken for granted. Reaching for her phone, which she had left on the bathroom counter, she opened the gallery once more. This time, as she looked at the photos of her baby, something struck her that she hadn't noticed before. The baby's features, the black hair, the shape of the nose, the curve of the mouth, were markedly different from her own. She tried to recall the other baby more clearly, a nagging feeling that its hair had been blonde. A chill ran down her spine as the realization hit her. Her heart pounded as she rushed out of the bathroom, barely remembering to wrap a towel around herself. Eloise made her way to the living room, where a large cabinet stood against the wall. With trembling hands, she pulled open one of the drawers, rifling through it until she found what she was looking for, a large A4 envelope. She took it to her bedroom, scattering its contents across the bed. Papers spilled out, and Eloise began frantically scanning them, searching for one document in particular, the sperm donor profile. As she read, memories flooded back. She and Corey had spent hours poring over donor profiles, carefully selecting criteria that matched their own characteristics. Since Corey's medical condition meant he couldn't father a child, they had wanted the baby to resemble them as much as possible. One of the key criteria they'd insisted on was blonde hair, like both of them had. Her eyes locked onto the relevant section of the document. Hair color, blonde. Eloise felt her world tilt on its axis. How could her baby have had such dark hair if the donor was blonde? Her mind raced with possibilities. Had there been a mix-up at the fertility clinic? Had she been given a different donor's sperm than the one she and Corey had chosen? The implications were staggering. Just as the weight of these new questions threatened to overwhelm her, Eloise was hit with a wave of physical discomfort, a sharp pain radiating through her abdomen and breast, reminding her of her postpartum state. She winced, one hand going to her stomach as she tried to steady her breathing. The pain brought her back to the present moment, reminding her of her physical need. She remembered Nurse Olivia mentioning an anti-log supplement for breast milk production. In her emotional state at the hospital, Eloise had forgotten to request it. Deciding she needed to address this, she put the papers back in the envelope. Quickly drying off and dressing, she realized that the idea of leaving her apartment again and going back to the hospital so soon filled her with anxiety. But she knew she needed to take care of herself, if only for the sake of her lost child. Gathering her bag, she double-checked that she had her phone and keys. Just as she was about to leave, her gaze fell on a framed ultrasound picture on her bedside table. The sight of it made her pause, a lump forming in her throat. After a moment's hesitation, she picked it up and slipped it into her bag. It felt wrong to leave without some tangible reminder of her son. Eloise stepped into the elevator, the faint hum of its descent echoing in the enclosed space. Her thoughts fixated on returning to the hospital for the supplement she had forgotten. The mirrored walls reflected her pale, drawn face as she smoothed her hair, as though tidying her appearance might bring some semblance of control to the day. Once in the lobby, she opened her phone and navigated to her taxi app with practiced efficiency. The glow of the phone illuminated her face, and her brow furrowed slightly as she glanced at the fare estimate. It wasn't cheap, and for a moment she hesitated. The anti-log supplement wasn't exclusive to the hospital pharmacy. Any well-stocked drugstore would carry it, and she could save time and money by heading to one closer to home. The logical solution was clear, but Eloise found herself lingering, her thumb hovering over the confirm ride button. The hospital's stark, sterile corridors flickered in her mind, tugging at her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just the supplement. It was something else, a faint but persistent pull, like a whisper she couldn't ignore. Perhaps she would find more answers to her nagging questions about her baby's passing. She tapped the button, and the screen flashed a confirmation. Her ride was on its way. The decision didn't feel entirely practical, but she dismissed the thought, rationalizing it as convenience. As the minutes ticked by, she wandered toward the mailroom, a habitual check more to kill time than anything else. The scent of paper and ink greeted her as she opened her mailbox. The metallic clink echoed softly among the usual clutter of bills and flyers when an envelope caught her attention, plain, unmarked, and without a return address. Eloise picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, as if it contained more than just a simple letter. Curiosity sparked, but she slipped it into her bag, deciding it could wait. Her cab would be here any moment. She returned to the lobby, adjusting her bag over her shoulder as she spotted the taxi pulling up to the curb outside. The crisp air greeted her as she stepped out, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't yet frame. Eloise climbed into the back seat, her focus shifting between the road ahead and the faint tug of the envelope against her side, both of them leading her back to the hospital. As the car pulled away from the curb, she reached into her bag for the mysterious envelope. She was about to open it when her phone suddenly rang. Eloise's heart skipped a beat as she saw Corey's name on the screen. Taking a deep breath, she answered the call. "Eloise?" Corey's voice came through, filled with worry. "What's going on? Why didn't you reply to any of my texts last night?" Eloise glanced at the taxi driver, acutely aware of his presence. Despite her discomfort discussing such private matters in this setting, she knew Corey deserved an explanation. I went into emergency labor last night," she began, her voice trembling. "But, Corey, the baby, he didn't make it. They said it was heart failure." She could hear Corey's sharp intake of breath. "Oh, Eloise, I'm so sorry. I was so far away, in Vietnam on business, and you were alone." Eloise continued recounting the baby's condition, as explained by the doctor, and her interaction with Nurse Olivia, who had assisted her in visiting the morgue. She shared every detail, right up to realizing she'd forgotten the supplement and her current trip back to the hospital. "I'm taking the first flight available," Corey said firmly. "I'll be there with you tomorrow, okay? Just hold on and take care of yourself until then. Call me if you need anything. I love you." After ending the call, Eloise felt emotionally drained. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city pass by in a blur. After a few moments, she remembered the envelope in her lap. With slightly trembling hands, she opened it. Inside, she found a love letter and a check. As she read the heartfelt words of encouragement and support for her and the baby, a small smile tugged at her lips despite her grief. She had received similar letters throughout her pregnancy, always unsigned but clearly from Corey. It touched her that he had gone to such lengths to support her from afar. Touched by his thoughtfulness, Eloise took a picture of the letter with her phone. She composed a message to Corey. *, "This is the 10th anonymous letter you've sent me, monthly, since I got pregnant. I've known it was you all along, even though we kept quiet about it for so long. It's so thoughtful, but you don't need to keep doing this. Thank you for standing by us, even from afar. I still remember when you agreed to us having a baby through a donor, despite the challenges of our long-distance relationship. Can't wait to see you tomorrow." As she hit send, the taxi pulled up to the hospital entrance. Eloise paid the driver and stepped out, the familiar facade of St. Mary's looming before her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. With a mixture of determination and apprehension, she walked through the sliding doors back into the place where her world had changed forever, just hours before. Just as Eloise was about to lean in closer, a hand grabbed her arm, pulling her away. Her heart raced as she stepped back, only to come face to face with Nurse Olivia. "Mrs. Eloise, what are you doing here?" "I thought you went home," Olivia whispered, guiding her away from the door and into an empty room nearby. "Please follow me. There's something I need to tell you," Olivia added once they were inside. Her expression shifted from concern to determination. "Mrs. Eloise," Olivia began, her voice low but anxious. "It's about the medication Dr. Greaves used during your labor. I didn't think I'd have the chance to talk to you again, but now that you're here, Eloise felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What about it? What do you mean? You're starting to scare me, Nurse Olivia. Taking a deep breath, Olivia continued, when I was cleaning up the labor room last night, after you were moved, I noticed the empty medication bottles. The pain relief you were given. It was fentanyl, an opioid. Eloise furrowed her brow in confusion. Isn't that normal? Opioids are sometimes used during labor for pain relief. Olivia nodded. Yes, sometimes. But the dose you were given was higher than the standard protocol. She pulled a small evidence bag from her pocket, containing an empty medication bottle. I kept this. Something didn't feel right. Eloise stared at the bottle, her mind racing. What does this mean for me? For my baby? Olivia's face grew grim. Using opioids for labor pain can affect a baby's breathing. It can make them unresponsive shortly after birth. The weight of her words hit Eloise hard. Are you saying this is why my baby died? Not heart failure like Dr. Greaves said? Olivia shook her head quickly. No, it's unlikely that the opioids caused your baby's death. Usually, they just make them very sleepy, and they don't wake up for a long time. She hesitated, clearly struggling. But I wasn't sure then. What do you mean? Eloise's voice shook. What aren't you telling me? Olivia's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry. I didn't speak up this morning, I was scared. I'm not as experienced as the other nurses. But I was in the room when your baby was born. He didn't cry and his heart rate was low. At the time, I didn't know about the fentanyl. I was preparing the vacuum extractor when Dr. Greaves administered it, and when he declared the baby stillborn, I believed him. Eloise's world tilted. But you're not sure now? She pressed, barely able to breathe. Olivia nodded. Earlier, when I saw Dr. Greaves carrying that box out of the morgue, I had doubts. Then my friend at the morgue told me he hadn't returned the access card. I started to suspect something. Why would the examination of a stillborn baby take so long? Eloise's mind spun. Could it be possible? Was there a chance her son was still alive? Olivia, Eloise whispered, her voice trembling. I need your help. We have to find out what's really going on. If there's even the smallest chance my baby is alive, or if there's any foul play, I need to know. With renewed determination, Eloise and Olivia made their way back to the room where Michael and Dr. Greaves had entered. Eloise's heart raced, a mix of fear and hope churning in her stomach. We need to be careful, Olivia warned. If what we suspect is true, they could be dangerous. Eloise nodded, trying to focus. As they approached the door, she could hear muffled voices inside. She peered through the small window, and what she saw made her gasp. There, in a hospital bassinet, was a baby, alive, healthy, and with blonde hair like her own, the very image of her. Oh my God, Eloise whispered, hand flying to her mouth. Olivia, I think that's my baby. Olivia, her eyes wide, nodded. The fentanyl side effects must have worn off. The baby's awake now. Anger and desperation surged through Eloise as she watched Dr. Greaves hand the baby to Michael. We have to get in there, Eloise said, reaching for the door handle, but Olivia stopped her. Wait, Olivia cautioned. We need to be smart. If we rush in, they might do something drastic. We need proof. Eloise clenched her fists, forcing herself to think calmly despite the storm inside her. You're right. But how? Olivia thought for a moment. The hospital records, she said suddenly. If we can access them, we might find evidence of what really happened. They rushed to the nearest nurse's station. Olivia quickly accessed the hospital database. Meanwhile, she called her friend Lindsay. I need you to check something for me, she said urgently. The baby brought in last night, the one Dr. Greaves said was stillborn, can you confirm the details? Eloise watched the computer screen, her heart in her throat. After what felt like an eternity, Olivia turned to her. Eloise, she began gently, her voice steady but pale, the records confirm it. The dark-haired baby in the morgue isn't yours. That child passed away 3 days ago. Your baby, the one with blonde hair, Was admitted to the morgue just last night. Eloise's stomach dropped. But why wasn't he placed in a freezer box? Olivia pointed to the records. Instead, he was placed in nursery room number 5, a room designated for rescued babies, usually left vacant. Eloise felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her. Her baby was alive, and Michael, her abusive ex-husband, was trying to steal him. "We need to call the police," Eloise said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and rage. Olivia nodded, already dialing. "I'm on it. You stay here. Don't confront them yet. Let the authorities handle this." As Olivia spoke to the police, Eloise's mind raced. How had Michael orchestrated this? Why was Dr. Greaves involved? And most importantly, how could she ensure her baby's safety? The wait for the police was agonizing. Every second stretched into eternity. But finally, Olivia ended the call, her face relieved but serious. "They're on their way," she said. "We need to stay put. They advised us not to confront Michael or Dr. Greaves. But they're coming. We're going to get your baby back." Eloise nodded, tears of anger and relief streaming down her face as they waited for the police to arrive. She steeled herself for the confrontation ahead. Her son was alive, and she would fight to bring him home. Eloise's voice faltered as she looked down at the peaceful face of her son. "He's our miraculous and merciful child," she whispered, feeling the weight of the name and its significance. Olivia smiled gently, her eyes softening with understanding. "He's lucky to have you, Eloise," Olivia said, her voice sincere. "You both deserve peace after all you've been through." Eloise nodded, holding her son tighter. Despite the chaos, the lies, and the horrors she'd faced, she finally had him back. This little boy, her Miles Asher Carter, was a symbol of resilience, love, and everything she'd fought for. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and determination fill her heart. No matter what the future held, she would protect him with everything she had. As the car slowly made its way to Eloise's apartment, the city lights reflecting off the windows, Eloise allowed herself to lean back, a rare moment of calm settling over her. It was still hard to believe everything that had happened, but she knew one thing for sure. Her son was alive, and she would never let anyone take him from her again. They arrived at Eloise's apartment, and the officers escorted her and Olivia inside, ensuring their safety. Eloise looked around, her home now feeling different, both familiar and foreign at the same time. But it was hers, and it was where she would raise her son. As she stood by the crib, looking at the small, serene face of her baby, Eloise whispered, "Welcome home, Miles. Mommy's never going to let you go."